First, we go to Milan, Italy, where Canada's Environment Minister is in climate talks with other nations. Those talks are the precursor to the big UN climate conference known as COP26. It will take place later this month, or rather a month from now, in Scotland. What will world leaders actually deliver on? Well, Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of Environment, and he is in Milan. Minister Wilkinson, thank you very much for joining the program. I know it's very busy there for you at this planning session, and I want to talk about COP, but I also want to start with the promises your party made over the course of the recent election campaign. You promised to put a cap on oil and gas emissions. You also promised to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. Can you take me through a timeline for both of those?
So the cap on oil and gas emissions in this country reflects the fact that it is the largest single source of emissions in Canada, and we need to see emissions go down in every sector. So it's not only a cap, it's also a requirement for binding 5-year targets to reduce emissions in line with achieving net zero by 2050. What we said was we were going to start with consulting with the Net Zero Advisory Body on how we would do that and the targets for 2025 and 2030, and the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, whoever that may be, myself or someone else, will be starting to do that right away.
That sure sounds like you're suggesting it might not be you. Are you expecting to be shuffled?
I serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, but everybody says that. Everybody says that. I serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. Are you? Look, you're at the COP meeting right now. Are you going to be at the next one?
Well, again, that is a choice for the Prime Minister to make. But I got into politics to fight climate change. I ran clean tech companies for many years before this. I have been enormously privileged to serve, and I think we've made a lot of progress. And I would be very pleased to be at COP. But of course, if the Prime Minister has other ideas about how I can best serve the government, I will, of course, do what he asks.
Fossil fuel subsidies. You've promised to accelerate their phase out. What does that look like, and when?
Well, we've already started. I mean, we've already either reduced or eliminated 8 different fossil fuel subsidies, those things that either incent the exploration or the production of fossil fuels. In our platform, we said we would eliminate them by 2023, which is actually 2 years ahead of our previous commitment and 2 years ahead of the rest of the G20. We have continued to work to ensure that we're actually moving down a path to eliminate them. We're also going to be going through a peer review with our counterparts in Argentina on that. But beyond just the straight fossil fuel subsidies, there's also financing that's provided to the fossil fuel industry. And we made a commitment that we would have arms like Export Development Canada reduce their exposure to the oil and gas sector in line with our targets for 2030 and 2050.
I want to talk to you about financing, but in the context of the Paris Climate Conference. At that conference in 2015, the richest nations of the world, Canada included, pledged $100 billion to help the less developed countries in this world actually come on side in terms of emissions reduction. So they haven't raised that much money. Here we are 6 years later. Which countries are stiffing that fund?
Well, as I think you know, David, yes, the funds flowing into international climate finance had slowed. The most recent numbers from the OECD showed that they'd slowed quite a bit. And that's why the United Kingdom, as the chair of this meeting in Glasgow, asked Canada and Germany to lead an effort to find the remaining funds that are required to achieve the $100 billion a year. We've spent a lot of time over the last few months working on it, even during the election. And certainly we've had many meetings with countries where we are twisting arms to see people raise their level of ambition. I am very optimistic. It was definitely a heavy lift at the beginning. My German counterpart actually described it as mission impossible at the beginning. But we've made enormous progress, and I think you're going to see a number of announcements coming forward. I am optimistic that we will achieve the $100 billion, but we have some more work to do over the coming few weeks.
I want to talk to you about a project here in Canada, thermal coal mine expansion. So this is something that your government had essentially placed an order on. Then the federal government came back to you and said, well, you didn't consult with the First Nation that is part of this. You have since gone back, talked to that First Nation, but you've ended at exactly the same place. How did you come to that conclusion, this decision to subject this thermal coal mine expansion to a federal review?
Well, there are two elements. The first is this project actually was split into two projects that both fell under the technical threshold for an automatic federal review. My decision was that the two projects actually should have been considered as one project, and therefore they met the technical requirements with respect to review. But I also have the power to designate projects, and in the context of Canada's commitment to phasing out coal use in this country, our leadership of the Powering Past Coal Alliance with the United Kingdom, helping other countries to phase out coal, it is certainly a relevant question for the federal government to look at whether expansion of thermal coal mines fit in that context. And I think, as you know, we came out with a policy statement that essentially said that they really didn't fit. So this review is important, and I think that we've made the right decision to move forward with this review.
Coal and other heavy industry are certainly responsible for a major portion of the fossil fuel emissions or carbon emissions in this country. But they're not the only ones. In fact, even larger than transportation is animal agriculture. And a lot of critics are saying, why is Canada not really paying attention to that? Why are we not hearing more from the world about the attempts to reduce the proportion of carbon emissions that are derived out of animal agriculture? Again, as I say, larger than the combined exhaust of all transportation. Why is it that doesn't seem to be an area we hear much about?
Well, it's an important issue area, although it's not bigger than transportation. Transportation is a quarter of Canada's emissions. Agriculture is probably more like about 8%.
Yeah, I'm speaking about globally.
Okay. And so it is an important issue. A lot of the emissions from agriculture actually are methane, not just CO2.
Mm-hmm.
And that does deal mainly with cows. We have put into place a number of measures to help us to address some of that, but it is an area going forward where I do think there's more focus. There is a global methane alliance that has been developed by the United States and the United Kingdom, or in the European Union, that is actually focused on methane generally and certainly captures agriculture. And that's something we're very interested in. We have focused on methane from oil and gas as the primary issue because it is a big source of emissions in this country. But we do need to do more on agriculture. There's no question.
The world's largest emitter is China. And if there is money to developing nations that is offered through this process, that $100 billion we were speaking about earlier, and Canada contributes to that, should Canadian money end up going to China to help them reduce their fossil fuel emissions, their carbon emissions?
Well, typically, most of the funding that is corralled here is directed towards least developed economies, and Canada and China is not a least developed economy. Mm-hmm. But we certainly do need to ensure that China is engaged in the same conversation we are, which is about reducing emissions. I was very pleased a couple of weeks ago to see China come forward and actually announce they would no longer finance coal projects outside of the country. That's something we've been pushing for a long time. And again, I think it's a product of some of the leadership that Canada and the United Kingdom have shown through the Powering Past Coal Alliance. But clearly, we need to be working with China as we need to be working with India and other countries around the world. This is a global problem. It requires global solutions.
While I've got you, because you sit around the cabinet table, and certainly you have been privy around that cabinet table to many of the discussions around Indigenous relations. And this government has claimed many advances in terms of reconciliation and improvements to the lives of Indigenous people in this country. Some Indigenous groups have given your government, in fact, kudos for coming up with the most difference, the most change, the most on that file. And yet some of those same Indigenous groups are now saying, what's with the Prime Minister being in Tofino and don't love the symbolism of it? Do you worry that in spite of the progress that you may have made, that even small incidents, small but symbolic incidents, erode some of the trust that you've built up?
Well, I certainly hope that folks reflect on the entirety of what this government and this Prime Minister have done. I would start by saying, the Prime Minister did participate in a ceremony in Ottawa. He has spoken to survivors across the country. It was at his initiative that we followed through on the calls to action that included creating the day that we are talking about. And I would just say on almost any measure, the progress that has been made in partnership with Indigenous peoples across this country on services, on economic development, on nature. I mean, the work we've done on Indigenous conserved and protected areas and guardians programs, has been quite significant. And there's lots more to do. But there is no relationship that is more important to this government and certainly to this prime minister. I mean, I've had the great privilege of
Was
sitting
this
at
the
that
right signal then to maintain that relationship if it's the most important? Was this the right signal?
Well, I think the prime minister has been honest, open, and genuine on this issue, throughout his term in office. I would tell you that there is no greater champion for this agenda than the Prime Minister of Canada, and I have complete confidence in him on these and other issues, because I do think that he feels the onus on all of us to pursue the reconciliation agenda and the importance of some of the work that we've done on an ongoing basis and need to continue to do. So I think that he is a very thoughtful person on these issues.
Minister Wilkinson, thank you very much for your time. I certainly appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.